They told you a story before you were old enough to question it, that if you wake up earlier, push harder, stay longer, and endure more than everyone else, success will eventually find you. Not immediately, never immediately, but eventually. Always eventually. Just far enough in the future to keep you moving. And you believed it, not because you were naive, but because the story was everywhere. In school, in your family, in every speech that praised exhaustion as character. Work became more than an action. It became morality. Effort became identity. And rest quietly turned into guilt. So you learned to measure yourself in output, in hours, in how much you could endure without breaking. You weren't chasing results anymore. You were chasing worth, proving over and over again that you deserved a place in a system that never clearly defined the reward. But here's the fracture in the narrative. If hard work alone created power, the hardest workers would be the most powerful people in the world. They aren't. Because the lie was never about effort, it was about direction. You were taught to focus on how much you give, not where it goes. To increase your output, but never question the structure receiving it. And that's where the control begins, quiet, invisible, efficient. When you believe effort is sacred, you stop evaluating its return. You keep pouring energy into systems you don't own, chasing outcomes you don't control, defending a process that slowly drains you, not because you're weak, but because you were trained to equate suffering with value. And once that belief is installed, the system doesn't need to push you anymore. You push yourself. You've been told it's a mindset problem, that if you feel stuck, exhausted, or behind, it's because you're not disciplined enough, not focused enough, not hungry enough. So you try to fix yourself. You optimize your mornings. You track your habits. You push harder, cut distractions, remove rest. You turn your life into a system of constant improvement, believing that if you can just become sharper, faster, more relentless, you'll finally break through. But nothing fundamentally changes, because the trap was never inside you. It was built around you. The hustle trap isn't a flaw in your psychology. It's a structure designed to keep you moving without ever arriving. It feeds you just enough progress to stay committed, just enough reward to stay addicted, and just enough uncertainty to keep you chasing. There's always a next level, a better version of you, a higher standard you haven't met yet. And that's the point, because a person who believes they are always one step away from enough will never stop running. They won't question the direction. They won't question the system. They'll only question themselves. So you internalize the pressure. You think the exhaustion is a sign of growth, the anxiety, a sign of ambition, the constant motion, a sign you're doing something right. But look closer. If the system truly rewarded effort fairly, the outcome wouldn't feel so distant, so inconsistent, so dependent on forces you don't control. The truth is quieter and more unsettling. You are not being trained to succeed. You are being conditioned to continue. And once you see that, the question shifts. Not, how do I work harder? But why does this system need me to? At first, it was just something you did. You worked hard because you had goals, because you wanted more, because effort felt like movement, and movement felt like control. But slowly, almost invisibly, it shifted. Work stopped being a tool. It became a mirror. You didn't just measure progress anymore. You measured yourself, your discipline, your worth, your place in the world. And without realizing it, you fused your identity with your output. Now, when you rest, it doesn't feel neutral. It feels like loss. When you slow down, it doesn't feel intentional. It feels like failure. And when someone else moves differently, calmer, less urgent, less consumed, you don't just question their strategy, you question their character. Because if they're right, then everything you've built yourself on becomes unstable. So you defend the grind, not because it's working, but because it defines you. You protect the pace, the pressure, the constant motion, because without it, you're forced to confront something far more uncomfortable. Who are you if you're not producing? This is where the trap deepens. Because once work becomes identity, control becomes effortless. No one has to push you. No one has to monitor you. You'll overextend, overcommit, and overwork voluntarily. You'll say yes when you want to say no. You'll stay when you should leave. You'll prove yourself in rooms that were never designed for you to win. Not because you lack awareness, but because your self-respect is now tied to your exhaustion. And that is the most efficient form of control. Because when a system owns your identity, it no longer needs your obedience. It already has it. The most effective control is never forced. It's framed. You're not told you're being used. You're told your effort matters, that your work has meaning, that what you're building is important, even if you don't own it, even if you can't keep it, even if it can disappear the moment the structure shifts. And that feeling meaning is enough, because once effort feels meaningful, you stop questioning its direction. You stop asking who benefits. You stop noticing that the outcome is always just out of reach, slightly delayed, subtly redirected. This is the illusion. Not that work is valuable, but that all work is equally yours. It isn't. Some effort compounds. Some effort evaporates. And the system is designed to blur that distinction. So you stay committed, loyal even, not to a person, but to a narrative, a quiet belief that if you keep showing up, keep giving more, something will eventually return to you in equal measure. But notice how the return is never clearly defined, only implied. Recognition instead of ownership, visibility instead of control, momentum instead of arrival. And because nothing is explicitly promised, nothing is technically taken. That's what makes it strategic. You're not being deceived through lies. You're being guided through selective truths. Yes, effort can create outcomes, but not all outcomes belong to the one who exerts the effort. And once you understand that, the illusion begins to crack. Because the question is no longer, does this matter? It becomes, who does it matter for? And in that shift from meaning to ownership, you start to see the structure clearly. Not as opportunity, but as design. They reward you. Not with control, not with ownership, but with recognition. A compliment in the meeting. A title that sounds heavier than it pays. A quiet nod that says, you're one of the good ones. And for a moment, it feels like progress. You stayed late. You delivered more. You carried what others avoided. And someone noticed. That's enough to keep you going. Enough to make the imbalance feel justified. But look closer at the exchange. You give time, energy, focus, years. They give validation. And validation is light. It feels good, but it holds nothing. You can't build on it. You can't compound it. You can't keep it when the structure decides you're no longer needed. Because praise is not power. It's a substitute for it. It keeps you engaged without giving you leverage. It acknowledges your effort without changing your position. And most importantly, it makes you feel valued without making you valuable in a way that can't be replaced. That's the distinction. You are appreciated, but not essential. Recognized, but not protected. Visible, but still interchangeable. And as long as the rewards remain symbolic, the system remains intact. Because a person chasing praise will tolerate conditions they would reject if they were thinking in terms of ownership. They'll accept more responsibility without asking for more control. They'll give more than they receive and call it growth. Not because they're unaware, but because the recognition softens the cost. This is how compliance is maintained. Quietly, efficiently. You don't need to be forced when you feel seen. But the question is never whether they see you. It's whether you can walk away and take anything real with you when you do. You were taught to measure value in effort, hours worked, tasks completed, how much you can carry without collapsing. The more you endure, the more valuable you must be. That's the equation you've been operating on. But it's incomplete, because effort is visible, value is not. Effort can be tracked, praised, and compared. It fits neatly into systems that need to evaluate you quickly. But real value doesn't live in what you give it, lives in what cannot be easily taken or replaced. That's the shift most people never make. They optimize output, not position. They become faster, sharper, more reliable, without realizing that reliability is exactly what makes them easy to control. Predictable, replaceable, safe. Because if your value depends on how much you do, then it can always be matched or exceeded by someone willing to do more. And there's always someone willing. So the metric changes. Not how hard do you work, but how hard are you to replace? Not how much do you contribute, but how much control do you retain over what you contribute? This is where leverage enters. Leverage is what allows your effort to extend beyond your presence. It separates time from outcome. It turns input into something that can scale, persist, and compound even when you're not actively involved. Without it, your value resets to zero the moment you stop. And that's the quiet dependency most people live with. They've built competence, not control, output, not ownership. So they keep working to maintain their position, never realizing the position itself is fragile. Because real value is not proven through effort, it's protected through structure. And once you see that, the goal is no longer to do more. It's to become less dependent on doing it all. At some point, the pressure stops coming from the outside. No one needs to remind you anymore. No deadlines, no supervision, no voice telling you to push harder. And yet you do. You wake up with a quiet urgency. You feel uneasy when you're still. You reach for work not because it's required, but because stopping feels wrong, uncomfortable, almost threatening. This is the shift. The system is no longer around you. It's inside you. What began as expectation has turned into instinct. You've absorbed the rules so completely that they now operate without permission. You enforce them on yourself more strictly than anyone else ever could. You call it discipline, but look closer. If it were discipline, it would be controlled, intentional, chosen. This feels different. This feels like compulsion. You don't just work to achieve something anymore. You work to escape something. A quiet sense of guilt, a subtle fear of falling behind, a lingering question of whether you're doing enough. So you stay in motion, not because it's effective, but because it silences the discomfort. And over time, that discomfort becomes your compass. It tells you when to move, when to stop, how much is enough. Except it never says enough. It only says more. That's the prison, not the workload, not the expectations, but the belief that your worth declines the moment you pause. Because once that belief takes hold, control becomes permanent. There is no off switch, no external boundary to push against. Just an internal loop that keeps you producing, consuming, proving, endlessly. And the most dangerous part? It feels like you. Not something imposed, but something chosen. And that's why it's so difficult to escape. You think you're overwhelmed because there's too much to do, too many tasks, too many demands, too many moving parts competing for your attention. So you organize, prioritize, optimize, trying to stay on top of it all. But consider a different possibility. What if the volume isn't accidental? What if the busyness is the point? Because a busy mind doesn't question direction. It doesn't step back. It doesn't pause long enough to ask whether the movement is meaningful or merely constant. It just continues, task after task, day after day, a continuous flow of activity that feels productive but rarely creates distance. You move, but you don't advance. You respond, but you don't decide. And in that state, something important disappears. Perspective. You don't see the structure you're operating in. You don't notice who's setting the pace, who's defining the priorities, who ultimately benefits from your attention being fully consumed, because you're too occupied to look. That's what makes busyness effective. It doesn't restrict you. It occupies you. It gives you a sense of control while quietly removing your ability to exercise it. You feel engaged, needed, involved. But your role is reactive. You're adjusting, adapting, responding, never truly directing. And over time, that becomes normal. Stillness starts to feel unnatural, even dangerous, because in stillness, the noise fades, the tasks stop. And without that constant input, you're left with a question you've been avoiding. Is this actually going somewhere? That question is disruptive. So you return to movement, to urgency, to the comfort of being needed. Not because it moves you forward, but because it keeps you from seeing that you might not be. At some point, continuing the same way stops making sense. You can work longer, push harder, refine your process, but the ceiling doesn't move. The returns stay proportional to your effort. 1 unit in, 1 unit out. Linear, predictable, contained. That's the nature of labor. It depends on your presence, your time, your energy, your attention. And no matter how efficient you become, it still requires you to be there, producing, maintaining, sustaining, which means the moment you stop, it stops. Leverage changes that, not by removing effort, but by repositioning it. Instead of asking, how can I do more? You begin asking, how can this continue without me? That question shifts everything, because now you're not focused on output. You're focused on structure, systems that hold value, assets that extend your reach, decisions that create outcomes beyond your direct involvement. You move from participation to design, from executing tasks to arranging conditions where tasks happen with or without you. And that's where scale begins. A single action, if placed correctly, can produce results repeatedly. A system, once built, can carry weight you no longer need to hold. Your effort doesn't disappear, it multiplies. But this shift is uncomfortable, because leverage requires you to slow down, to step back, to think in terms that don't provide immediate feedback. There's less visible motion, fewer quick wins, no instant validation, which means, from the outside, it can look like you're doing less. But you're not. You're changing the nature of what you do, from temporary output to persistent value. And once that transition begins, the question is no longer how hard you can work. It becomes how little your work needs you to exist. At the end of this shift, something subtle changes. You don't become louder. You don't become more aggressive. You don't even appear more ambitious. You become harder to move. Not because you resist everything, but because you're no longer driven by the same triggers. Urgency doesn't pull you. Praise doesn't anchor you. Fear of falling behind doesn't accelerate you. And without those levers, control weakens. Because most systems don't rely on force. They rely on predictability. They know what you'll say yes to. They know what you're afraid to lose. They know how to keep you engaged through pressure, validation, or the quiet suggestion that you're not doing enough. But when those patterns break, the system loses its grip. You stop reacting on cue. You stop performing for approval. You stop proving what no longer needs to be proven. And in that space, a different kind of power emerges. Not visible, not loud, but stable. You can walk away from what doesn't serve you without hesitation. You can pause without guilt. You can say no without needing to explain it. Because your position is no longer dependent on constant output or external validation. It's structured. You've built something, whether it's a system, a skill, a network, or a form of ownership that doesn't collapse the moment you disengage. And that changes how you move. You choose where your effort goes. You decide what deserves your energy. You participate by design, not by default. That's what makes you difficult to control. Not defiance, not resistance, but independence from the incentives that once guided you. And once that independence is real, not performed, not temporary, you exit the cycle entirely. You're no longer trying to win within the system. You're no longer shaped by it. You've become something it can't easily use.